Good morning. So, as I think almost everybody's aware of the death of Caroline Meister at Tassajara after she had gone hiking. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. I think you know that many people in the San Francisco Zen Center are very affected by what happened, which makes sense. She lived at Green Gulch and also lived at Tassajara. I think some of us who probably when we were down there last summer for the Tassajara Sangha week, we met her. She was Shiga. So I remember meeting her. And anyway, obviously people are deeply affected by this. And I think many of us in this Sangha followed along with the news, worried about her for the 4 days that they looked for her. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And Caroline's Dharma name, which she received when she took the precepts, was So Shi Go Kong, and it means ancestral kindness diamond root. Ancestral kindness diamond root. And that name was given to her by her precepts teacher, who's abbot at Green Gulch, Abbot Jiryu. I'm not so sure how to pronounce his last name. Rutzman Meyer, I think, is close to what his last name is. Anyway, Jiryu gave her precepts probably a couple years ago. And, you know, he was thinking about her name, of course. When you give someone precepts, you think, well, you know, what are the qualities of this person? I want to give them, you know, a name that fits them. So I think probably this name, the name ancestral kindness, he was probably thinking about her kindness as a person. If you see pictures of her, she just kind of radiates this sort of buoyant spirit and kindness. And you could see where he would have thought about that and reflected on her good spirit and her generosity. And so he wanted to name her this name, ancestral kindness, this sense of the ancestors, the Buddhas and ancestors, and how they have kindly given to us this practice and passed it down generations through generations, so that now that we can do this practice as well. So to bring in this idea of this ancestral lineage that we have, a kind of deep and compassionate and joyous mind that's based on this bodhisattva practice, our bodhisattva vows. And then diamond root is probably a reference to Vajra, this sense of wisdom, the diamond wisdom, this indestructible jewel of the Dharma. And so he was saying, you know, she was this indestructible essence of heart and mind that carried the Dharma, this essential nature. So if you think about this ancestral kindness and the Vajra, this diamond root, this deep wisdom root of practice, in this way she embodied compassion and wisdom. He was hoping for her, as for all of us, right? As teachers, we want to give you Dharma names that are encouraging. You know, we don't give you Dharma name that says, you know, this person's a terrible practitioner or something like that. You know, we always want to give a Dharma name and a way name that is encouraging to you, so that you feel buoyed by that, but also that actually reflects your deepest essential nature. So it's not a lie. This is seeing into our essential nature, seeing into our goodness. So if we combine this kindness, compassion, and this Vajra diamond wisdom together, we have, the Tibetans talk about this a lot, we end up with skillful means, right? We end up with realization. This is what practice realization is, this way in which we bring forth this practice for those that we are relating to. So this is what Jiryu's wish was for her, and that what he saw in her when he gave her the precepts. So Caroline Meister was 30 years old, and she went for a day hike on her day off. And that was on March 18th. And she was found dead at the base of a waterfall on Friday, the 22nd. As soon as Caroline's parents knew that she was missing, they lived in Chicago, I believe. They came and to Tassajara, and their names are Jean and John. And they were there while people were looking for her. And then when her body was found, it was cremated, and they took her ashes back to, her mom took her ashes back to Chicago. And according to one of the blogs I read, the coroner in Monterey said that Caroline had hit her head and her neck when she fell, and she probably died immediately. So it was probably, if she had any conscious notion of what was going on, it was happening probably very, very fast. So now here's a little interesting piece about this. A woman named Shoren Heather wrote in a blog about that she writes, I guess, about Tassajara. And she was writing about Caroline, and she said that the day before the hike, Caroline was talking to a friend of hers in the courtyard at Tassajara, and he said to her, "What would you do if you knew you had 24 hours to live?" And her response was, "I'd go for a long hike alone in the wilderness." Right? It's kind of amazing. But on the other hand, it's not that remarkable, because as Zen students, we think a lot about impermanence. As Zen students, we think about, how are we living our lives? So in some ways, there they were down at Tassajara in this monastic environment, practicing and talking probably about the Dharma and impermanence, and saying, what would you want to do if you knew this was the last day of your life? And so it's not actually in some ways so surprising they had that conversation. And of course, it's wonderful to know that what, unfortunately, she said that she wanted to do is exactly what she did. So that's kind of interesting. But it reminds us, that our lives are impermanent, that we are very fragile in many ways. So how upset we are about Caroline's death, probably has to do with how well we knew her, how close we were to her. And if we were close to Caroline, I would say at this point, we are grieving. And we would deeply feel her absence if we were grieving her death. And she would probably have been somebody who affected us personally in a very deep way, who we knew very well. I think that, I think that if we are talking about grieving, and if you are grieving too about Caroline's death, if there's somebody online who knew her well, or I would say that at this point, what I'm going to talk about in the lecture here has to do with impermanence and practice in relationship to impermanence. But if we are grieving, we are in the country of grieving, which is not the country of talking about, I think, about so much about impermanence and practice in some ways. Because when we're grieving, we are deeply feeling emotions that are not about the head at all. Do you know what I mean? They're really about trying to be in that country of grieving. And that country of grieving is a place unto itself. And so if you're grieving about Caroline's death, then please just grieve and don't worry about the rest of the talk. So, but I think what most of us are feeling in this situation is empathy. I think what we're mostly feeling is empathy. So, grief has to do with a great personal loss. Losing someone that's integral to our identity, I think, is something that comes up when we're grieving. Somebody who's attached to, that we attach to our identity and our sense of functioning in this world. I had a close friend who died of pancreatic cancer in 2003, really, really close friend of mine. I think I grieved for her more than my parents dying. It was like, I would just be like somewhere and just suddenly start to cry. It was just overwhelmed with this feeling of loss. And so I would just cry and just feel loss. So I think when we're grieving, we need to just grieve. You know, we don't have to add anything to it. We can just grieve. So we feel overcome by that, this great loss. But empathy, I think, is more about how we feel and relate to the pain that others are feeling, having sympathy for that. So I feel deep, because I lived at San Francisco Zen Center for 17 years and trained there. I feel a deep sense of community, and I know that many of you feel a deep sense of community for San Francisco Zen Center, in part because Jaku and I trained there, but also many of you have been to Tassajara, you know people at San Francisco Zen Center. So we feel empathy for their suffering, you know, for what they're going through. And when we think about it, we just feel empathy in general, because we can imagine what it's like to have this experience of a friend of yours dying in a way like this. So we feel their suffering. You know, also this week, this cargo ship hit the base of that bridge, the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. And there were 6 people who were, they think, there were 6 guys who were working on that bridge who were killed. And one of their coworkers who was not there that night said that in all likelihood, they were, at that time, this is like 1:30 in the morning, they were probably on a break, sitting in their trucks, you know, drinking coffee or something and chatting with each other when that happened. And if you can imagine, it happened so suddenly that, you know, they barely had time to probably register what was happening to them. And 2 of the workers who were found were in the cab of their truck. So probably that's exactly what was happening. And I think about, you know, what was that like for them to have that experience? You know, what was going through their minds? And I think, you know, this is a kind of empathy too, this way in which we as human beings can feel that, what, you know, imagine what that feeling was like. So I think, you know, in Caroline's case, of course, I hope that she did not suffer. And it sounds like it happened really fast, what happened to her. And also, of course, for the people on the bridge, we hope that they did not suffer. So I think that we feel a lot of empathy, and we can imagine what that is like for their family and friends to have this experience. So, you know, we can relate to grief, and we can relate to having these sudden changes that just kind of catapult us into these alternate realities that we experience with these kinds of really deep emotional experiences and loss that we experience. So Pei was telling me about listening to a lecture that Linda Cutts gave on, I think it was on Sunday. So I went back and listened to the lecture to see what Linda had said about what had happened to Caroline. So she said that the loss of Caroline for the Sangha members was like, she said, sitting in the midst of the flames of sorrow, sitting in the midst of the flames of sorrow. So Dogen talks about this in a fascicle called Kuge, Flowers of Emptiness, and he talks about bodhisattvas sitting in the flames of samsara, of this Saha world, that the bodhisattva is willing to sit in the middle of the suffering. You know, we talk about Avalokiteshvara hearing the cries of the world, and this ability to sit in the middle of this suffering. And right now, people at San Francisco Zen Center are sitting in the middle of this deep sorrow and the flames of this sorrow. But you know, this is the activity of the bodhisattva. The activity of the bodhisattva is to sit in the middle of the flames of the suffering of this world, to be willing to be in the middle of this. And I don't mean this in any kind of maudlin way or some kind of heroic way, but in this way that we're willing to face our own lives, this way that we're willing to, when these experiences happen to us, that we're willing to face and look at what we are experiencing and not run away from them. That is sitting in the midst of the fire. It's not running off to another country or doing something heroic. It's about your own life. Are we willing to sit in the middle of the fire of our own life and pay attention to that. So this willingness to sit in the middle of our own suffering. This also isn't a morose statement. It's just a reflection of our vows to help each other. It's a reflection of our vows to be here for each other in this room, in this town, in this life, and to really stand with each other. And so, of course, we have joy, we have faith, we have love, we have all those good things to sustain us, and we should cultivate those good things. And but we also have sorrow and grief and hate and greed and jealousy and ill will and loss and all those things as human beings that we get caught in, that we practice with. So all of this is churning around. All of this is happening in our life. So, Linda Cutts made this statement. She made this statement about sitting in the flames of sorrow. So the whole sangha, sitting close to them, and we sit close to that sangha. And I think we sit close to probably a little, not as close, but thinking about those people on that bridge. And, we think about people in wars, and we think about that. But I think this is very close to us because in distance, it's very close, but also because we have some imagination, some connection, some way of actually feeling this connection with the Sangha at San Francisco Zen Center. So when we have these experiences, we shouldn't try to cut them off. We have to just go on and try to live and be present for that as best we can. And then over time, our feelings change, but we shouldn't try to force some kind of transformation, but to actually just be present for what we're feeling. So Linda Cutts also said she lived a life of kindness and compassion. And how many people has she touched? She lived a life of kindness and compassion. And then she asked, and how many people has she touched? And Linda reminded us that we all touch each other's lives, and that we should be aware of the fact that our actions have these kinds of good repercussions and maybe not so skillful repercussions. So that we need to think about our relationships and how we affect each other, how they ripple out. And, I don't want to be too heavy about this, but I think we need to think about our responsibilities in our relationships. And we have to try to practice each moment with each other as we relate to each other. And sometimes, of course, it's easy. We don't have any problems, but when we do have problems, we need to think about this deeply. And it sounds like Caroline was a naturally buoyant person. You see those pictures of her? Every one of those pictures, she looks kind of radiant, and seems like she was somebody that was probably fairly easy to get along with, but I'm sure she had her struggles as well. I'm sure she had the things that she had to struggle with. So Dogen talks about this, and in Zen, we talk about our life and our practice with each other, and we say very succinctly, don't waste time, or make that come, don't waste time. So, this don't waste time in Zen pretty much encapsulates this feeling about birth and death. Caroline was 30 years old, and, we say, oh, wow, somebody shouldn't die that young. They're only 30 years old. Yet, many infants die. They die as they're born. They die weeks afterwards. People die as children. People die as, all throughout the stages of life. And it's happening all the time that people die. And we don't tend to think about it very much. But really, this human life is very fragile. Life is very fragile. So, sometimes we just don't think about this. As a matter of fact, we don't even think about dying at all. I remember that until I got to be a certain age, I would always say, if I die, if you die, it was like somehow in my mind, I wasn't a death material. It was like, if I die. And then at a certain age, I don't know, 50 or 60 or something, I realized I was saying if. And I thought to myself, if? What do you mean if? You are going to die. so it's not an iffy proposition here. And so this way that, that we pay attention to that, and we think about that, the preciousness of this opportunity that we have in our lives. Dogen said, and this is in Zui Monkey, Dogen said, students of the way, like the students of the way, he's saying to his students, it goes without saying that you must consider the inevitability of death. The principle is certain, right? It's certain. Even if we do not consider this right now, we should resolve not to waste time. We should spend our time carrying out that which is worth carrying out. We should resolve not to waste our time, and we should carry out that which is worth carrying out. I remember I had a student one time, and I can relate to this, who said to me, well, I know what I should do, but I don't feel like doing it, so I'm not going to do it right now. So this way in which I know that I should go apologize to somebody, but all the reasons for why I don't want to apologize to them, it's like, I'm not going to do it now. I'll do it some other time. So this way in that we put off practice, we put off the hard stuff because it's hard to do, and also because it doesn't fit our idea of self. It doesn't fit our idea of who we are. It's like, oh, I'm sure it's their fault. I'm sure it's actually their fault. So I don't have to go and apologize for something that I did, or I don't want to do that right now. You could die. You could die. So this way that we don't waste our time, we know how to do the practice, that we actually do the practice. So Dogen's saying, this is a key teaching about impermanence, about death. What are we doing with our life, right? What are we doing with our life? Caroline's death and the death of the workers on the Baltimore Bridge was so unexpected. Bang, it just happened. They did not have time to rectify their regrets. They didn't have time to fix any relationships. They didn't have time to do any of that stuff. So we should keep this in mind. This could happen to us. We should keep this in mind. When Dogen says, don't waste time and refrain from doing meaningless things, he says, let the Dharma direct your life. Think about the Dharma. Think about who you want to be. Think about the things that we can improve. And I also encourage you to think about the things you do well, because that's important too. Because this practice is not about beating yourself to a pulp, but it is about paying attention. It's about paying attention to your life. Pay attention to your practice. Put everything in practice. And Dogen's not saying, well, he might be, but I'm not saying, don't, not have fun. Read silly books, go dancing, laugh with your friends, drink a glass of wine, have a good dinner, and don't waste time. So don't waste time. And in many ways, that's not wasting time. That's taking care of yourself too, because you need those times to take care of yourself. So, remember to keep your life to think about your life as practice, and do the difficult practices that are about letting go of your selfishness, so that, we take care of business. We're taking care of business. And at the same time, be kind to yourself and be kind to others. So look at your life through the lens of practice, and make sure that you kind of clean up your messes as best you can when you can, and that you don't put it off, because we do live in impermanence and our lives can be cut off in a moment. So we don't want to waste our time in not practice. So our vow as bodhisattvas is to sit in the fire of our life, sit in the fire of your life and practice the Dharma. Pretty simple, right? Pretty simple instructions, and super difficult to do. Simple instructions, hard practice, and that we make this effort. So sit in this fire, recalling impermanence, should be a motivation to really address our lives. Think of the preciousness of our life, the preciousness of our relationships, the preciousness of going outdoors and hearing the rain on the roof, and going outdoors and seeing the clouds and feeling the wind, and all of those beautiful things about being alive. And the beauty of these relationships that we have with each other, and that we want to cultivate that and keep that going. So thinking about Caroline's death and the death of others who died suddenly, use that as a way to encourage ourselves for them. Let's do our practice for Caroline. Let's do our practice for the guys who were killed on the bridge in Baltimore. Let's do our practice for the people in Palestine. Let's do our practice for, all the people who are suffering in the world, for the people in Israel who are suffering, the people in every place, the person next door to you, and for ourselves. So anyway, I just want to encourage you with this and remind you, we cannot escape death. We do not know when we're going to die. So let's please take care of our business. Thank you very much.